A very warm welcome to Too Hot for Radio. I like all this talk about heat because it's actually freezing outside at the moment. So hopefully we'll warm up as we spend some time looking at a very controversial topic, and one that I promised that we would return to a number of months ago. So for all of you that have been waiting with bated breath for weeks and weeks for our return to the transgender topic, now is your time. Stuart's not with me today, but I'm joined on the phone by Sharon James. She is an author, conference speaker, and currently is working with the Christian Institute. And she's just written a book called Gender Ideology: What Do Christians Need to Know? Thanks so much for joining me today, Sharon.
That's a pleasure.
So, I mean, this is a hot topic. It's a bold book to write, really, in 2019. Why have you decided to get involved in this complicated discussion?
The first thing we have to say is that when we do encounter people with genuine gender confusion, we hold in mind that every human being is made in the image of God, because as Christians we respect all people, whatever their claims about identity or lifestyle or beliefs. But the really important thing to hold in mind, Tom, is that that does not mean that we have to accept or endorse everyone's claims about their identity or lifestyle or beliefs, because you can respect a person without having to affirm their beliefs. And that distinction isn't always understood. So I wrote this book because I want to help people understand that behind all of those heartbreaking stories of gender confusion, there is actually a very dangerous lie, the lie of gender theory. And this theory, put simply, claims that we all have something called a gender identity that can be separated from our biological sex. And of course this claim isn't scientifically proven, but the alarming thing is it is shaping laws, it's shaping educational policies, and it's doing a huge amount of damage, especially to very vulnerable children.
It does seem, I imagine, to many people that this transgender movement really has come from nowhere. You know, the last few years it's dominated. But your chapter in the book, Where Did Gender Theory Come From? That was, I think, really useful for me personally to actually realise this isn't new. There's been many things over, well, many decades really, leading up to this point. Can you kind of summarise a little bit of the history then of why we are where we are now?
Well, up to now, and I'm saying up to now broadly this century, maybe the last century, every culture has recognised the central significance of the man-woman bond. But there are some in more recent decades who want to normalise homosexuality, and they want to eliminate what they call heterosexism. That's the idea that heterosexuality, man-woman sex, is normal. But then they go further than that because they want to get rid of the idea that it's normal to even be either male or female. And some denounce this biological truth as binary and oppressive. And they want us to truly believe that a person with a womb can really be a man. Now, of course, this is flying in the face of biological reality. The biological male-female distinction is hardwired into nature. But in the book, I outline the claims of both the key thinkers of the sexual revolution and the cultural revolution, and I explain how their ideas converged together to produce gender theory. But to put the point very simply, our culture denies that we've been created by God. And then it denies that the creator God has given us absolute standards for all people at all times. And when you deny that, the only remaining moral absolute is to be faithful to yourself, to be true to yourself, to find your own identity. And so in that mindset, that culture, to challenge anyone's claims to their own unique identity or orientation is viewed as hateful. And that's why Christians often stay quiet. But I don't think we should be intimidated, because what's the logical outcome of that thinking? Do we have to affirm every identity, every orientation? What about those who claim to be a different age or race or species? There's actually no end point to this way of thinking.
There have been a few moments, haven't there, over the last few years, some of those things you mentioned of someone who tried to identify as a younger age because he didn't feel like he was, and this is genuinely happening right now. And as you kind of mentioned a second ago about men feeling like they should be, in a sense, can't be told that they can't have a baby. My wife is actually a midwife, and she has had someone who is transgender giving birth who has to be referred to as it is his vagina, it is his womb. It's, I'm sure a lot of people will know of the LGBT. That seems to be the acronym that's used the most, but that does seem to be growing, and you kind of mention that in the book. So what is its latest incarnation, and what do all the letters stand for?
Well, it is a moving target, but LGBT stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans people. But you'll often now have Q added, standing either for queer or questioning. You would have I added, standing for intersex. And you might have A added, standing either for allied or asexual. But then you'll get a plus sign, and that will mean anything else, any other non-heterosexual identity.
Is it right to say that the intersex, which you mentioned there near the end of that acronym, you mention it as being very rare in the book? Isn't it right to say that then that's really the only birth condition that you could kind of say, actually, that is something that someone is born into?
The correct thing that we can certainly affirm, Tom, is that transgender people are biologically completely normal. And transgenderism is a very different situation from intersex conditions. That's certain.
Yeah. Now, I was struck by how, in your chapter, Male and Female by Design, a lot of your arguments kind of stand even if you were to take out the specific references to God. Obviously, we don't want to do that. We are both Christians. This is a Christian podcast. But in that sense, then, you could argue that it isn't simply a Christian or non-Christian issue.
I couldn't agree more, because this is a matter of scientific truth, objective reality. It's also a free speech issue. It's an issue of child protection. It's an issue of trying to defend safety and privacy. It's an issue of fairness in sports and more. And Christians can find common ground with non-Christians on wanting to speak out on all of those issues, because we'd all agree that, or many people, both Christian and non-Christian, would agree that gender ideology is harming people, especially young people and children. And as this ideology gains ground, we sadly see more and more people damaged. Now, I believe Christians should be taking a clear lead in speaking out against gender ideology, but sadly, in the name of a false compassion, many are just staying quiet about it. And I find it really sobering that some of those who are speaking out most clearly and powerfully against gender ideology are non-Christians. So I'm thinking of someone like Posey Parker, that's the stage name of Kelly J. Keane-Minshall, who wants to defend women's spaces. Or I'm thinking of the atheist writer Douglas Murray, or the atheist Brandon O'Neill of Spiked Online, or indeed the Canadian lecturer Jordan Peterson. And such people are very clear that we shouldn't be pushed into telling lies in the name of false compassion. And of course there are increasing non-Christians as well as Christians who have been deceived by this ideology, but they're now detransitioning. They were wrongly encouraged to think that transitioning would solve their issues. They now realise it was deception. They want to return to live in keeping with their true sex. And there are people of all faiths and persuasions in that category of people.
So you mentioned you do think Christians should be more vocal, those who hold to the authority of Scripture.
Yeah.
What kind of ways do you think? And I know as we kind of say this, people are just like, man, I'm going to get in trouble. I could have issues in my job. I could have issues in my wider family. What do you encourage Christians to do? How can they stand out?
Well, I suppose the first thing I'm bound to say is I'd love people to read my book, because I've tried to explain as simply as possible what's lying behind this, because I believe that if we understand that, then we won't be intimidated and we won't be afraid, and we'll realise that we're on common ground with plenty of non-Christians. But then I would also flag up that the Christian Institute does have people who can advise if people are genuinely alarmed about their situation regarding employment or what's going on in the schools their children are at. We have an education officer who can advise. We have a legal defence team who can advise. So, number one, get informed, but number two, know that there are people who can give advice if you're genuinely concerned.
I have heard a couple of people recently, professing Christians, who would say, I know where I stand on homosexuality, but I don't think there's anything clear in Scripture talking about the transgender issue, and so that's why I would remain silent, or that's why I would not come down on either side. What do you make of that? Because you'll often find Christians go, I need to see a specific passage in verse that means this is wrong. How do you respond to that?
I would respond by saying that the whole Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, is predicated on God's good design, and the whole central point of history salvation offered by God, the picture used to explain or point to that in Ephesians 5 is man-woman marriage. And so from the Garden of Eden right through to Revelation, you have man-woman marriage as a symbol of something far greater. And that man-woman bond is affirmed by the Lord Jesus Christ himself, where he directly quotes the creation account. And it's quoted by Paul as well, the creation account. So I think that is a very sad failure to recognize the storyline and the biblical theology behind the whole scripture account. And if anything, the clear man-woman bond created by God, I would have thought would be something Christians should be even more determined to speak out on than the other issue of behaviours.
There are some incredibly alarming stories when you go online and see the implications of the transgender movement, what that means for prisons, what that means for toilets, what that means for sports, as you mentioned. If this is just allowed, let's just say that, in a sense, it doesn't, the transgender movement is not really challenged. What do you think the world could look like in 10 years? I know that's very difficult to say, but where could this lead if it's left?
Well, sadly, we're going to see more and more damaged people. Sadly, we'll see more and more detransitioners, in other words, those who regret their transition with all of the hurt and suffering that represents. In addition to that, we'll see further erosion of freedom of conscience, freedom of speech. We'll see further erosion of the rights of conscience for medical professionals, and we'll see further challenges to religious freedom. So that's why we need to see with absolute moral clarity that we cannot be passive and quiet about gender ideology. We just have to understand it, and we have to oppose it. I'll give you one example, Tom. In 2018, Dr. David Mackereth was dismissed from his role as a health and disabilities assessor at the Department of Work and Pensions. And you might say, well, why? And the reason is because he believes that a man is a man, even if that person identifies as a woman. And when judges dealt with this case, they ruled, and I quote, "Belief in Genesis 1:27, lack of belief in transgenderism, conscientious objection to transgenderism, in our judgment, are incompatible with human dignity."
Wow.
Now, we just need to hear how chilling that is, because what's next? You're saying what is coming. Churches told that they cannot teach the truth of Genesis 1:27. Churches told that they're not allowed to read Genesis 1:27 out loud because it constitutes hate speech. And we are on a very alarming trajectory unless this ideology is very strongly confronted.
I think one of the most disturbing aspects of this is young people. Why do you think we're seeing such a rise in the number of young people identifying as transgender?
Well, there's a whole variety of reasons. Sadly, an increasing number of young people are confused and unhappy about their bodies and about their identity. And one factor I'd point to is the radical feminist movement, because they campaigned for women to so-called enjoy the same sexual freedoms as men, but that has contributed to the horrific sexualization of Western culture, where pornography is easily accessed by ever younger people. But of course, all of that fuels sexual harassment of girls, and then girls may conclude that if being a so-called successful girl must mean looking and behaving like to put it brutally, a porn star, they'd rather not be girls at all. And especially girls who've been victims of sexual abuse may find it safer to identify as a boy. But it's not just girls. In our over-sexualized culture, there's almost as much pressure on young men to present an idealized male body. So if a boy is smaller than average, bad at sports, judged to be effeminate, he may be bullied. And if a boy has negative male role models in his own life, he may associate masculinity with violence and think, well, I don't want to be like that. So lots of factors, but all of the unhappiness and confusion caused by other factors only increase if then children are taught that they have to construct their own identity. I think that children should just be allowed to be confident in their own bodies, confident that they're a boy or a girl. Let's let children be children.
Absolutely. I had a situation with my youngest daughter just the other day. She said, "I'm a boy." I said, "Oh, why is that?" And she said, "Because I want to marry," and she mentioned her best friend in school. And it was a really interesting mix of things, which when we talked to her about it, she said, "I just love my friend so much, and I want to be married to her." And this had followed the fact that, say, maybe a few weeks earlier, she'd also said she wanted to get married to her best friend. And I just said to her, well, God has designed marriage to be between one man and one woman. so you wouldn't be able to marry your best friend because you're a girl and she's a girl. And I think that had probably stuck in a 6-year-old brain. Well, if I'm going to marry my best friend, I'll have to be a boy. Simple as that. It's logical for a 6-year-old, maybe not for us. But it just made me realise that what I say, obviously she'd taken on board what I'd said previously, and what she'd come up with wasn't right. That wasn't the outcome isn't that she should be a boy. The fact is she should be able to be a 6-year-old girl and just have friends and want to spend time with her best friend. That's all good. But you imagine if I had got my own agenda and I decided, yes, maybe you are a boy, or yes, you can marry whoever you want, and continue to reinforce that.
And that's the most natural thing in the world, isn't it? Any parent would say, yes, little children go through phases of wanting to marry their best friend or their daddy. They love their daddy. But we don't. What we shouldn't do is impose adult notions of sexual motivation, impose those on young children. I regard that as child abuse when we impose sexualized motives on little children like that.
Is it right to say that most confused children then, those that would think, I'm actually a boy even though, I was born a girl or whatever it is, that puberty kind of sorts out that confusion?
Absolutely, and that's the good news. There is a totally natural way of resolving any childhood gender confusion, and it is, as you say, called puberty. When children do genuinely experience discontent with their biological sex, if puberty is allowed to take its natural course, then those issues resolve themselves in up to 90% of cases.
There are many people that are transitioning or have, some that regret it, some that don't. We're going to be dealing, as you suggested, with many, many more broken people in the future. What do you encourage churches to do? We've got any church leaders or elders who are listening, and
indeed.
Someone comes into church. Where do you begin with to deal with that?
I think that the tragedy is that the church has been silent, which has allowed this to take hold even among Christians. And the leadership of churches, I think, can be proactive in terms of, first and most important, providing biblical teaching about God's good design for men and women. I touch on that a lot more in my other book, God's Design for Women in an Age of Gender Confusion, which was also published this year by Evangelical Press. So biblical teaching on God's good design for men and women, but then also be proactive in providing teaching on this specific issue. So the Christian Institute has sometimes been called into churches to maybe provide an evening of information teaching on this issue, or churches may want to, they could take that short book that I've written and use that as a study guide. So I think, A, the positive story, God's good design, but B, let people be fully informed and aware of this ideology. The worst thing to do is to be like the proverbial ostrich and just stick our heads in the ground and wish it would go away.
Would you encourage Christians to refer to transgender people with their preferred pronouns?
No, I wouldn't. Now, of course, we mustn't treat anyone with rudeness or hostility, and we are to be gentle and kind and respectful to everyone, but we are also to be truthful. I'm not saying that Christians should insist on calling transgender people with the correct pronoun, that's the pronoun of their biological sex, because that will cause provocation and offence. But you know what? In most situations, you can avoid using sex-specific pronouns altogether. Now, full names are another issue. There are often non-sex specific or shortened names or nicknames which can be used without giving offence or going against your conscience. But the important thing to remember is that we should not be pushed into using incorrect pronouns. The central argument of my book is that gender ideology is a lie, and we've got to understand that a man cannot transition to be a woman, and a woman cannot transition to be a man. And when we've understood that, then we understand that to refer to a man as she is a lie, and to refer to a woman as he is a lie. And Christians are called on to tell the truth and to avoid lies, commandment number 9, because God is a God of truth. So this is a conscience issue, and we should not be called on to say what we know to be untrue.
And people will probably be aware, I think you mentioned earlier about Jordan Peterson and how he very controversially kind of refused to do it. I think some Christians would think, well, that it doesn't seem like a very compassionate thing. You know, if someone wants me to call them by a different pronoun, why would that be an issue?
Yes, you're right. Today, many, including many Christians, assume that we should affirm everyone's claims about their own orientation or identity, but how far should this extend? To race? To age? every claimed sexual orientation? We need to remember that we can respect people as people without having to affirm their lifestyles or their claims about their identity. As I've said, we must always oppose bullying or cruelty, but it's false compassion to affirm the claims of transgender people, not least because it negates the rights and privacy and dignity of others. It may seem like a small thing to call a man who's transitioned she, and it may seem like the polite and kind thing to do, and many might say it's a Christian thing to do, but it's really not, because it's an untruth. It's the same untruth that says when female prisoner A is raped in prison by fellow prisoner B, who is biologically male but identifies as female, then prisoner A has been raped by a woman. But that totally trivializes the trauma of prisoner A's rape. And those who have transitioned and later regretted it say that when they demanded affirmation of their assumed gender, they did deeply resent those who refused to offer them affirmation. But now they look back and realize that those who affirmed their false identity were showing false compassion. And those who refused to do so were displaying true compassion. And we have to remember the families of people who are transitioning because they often feel deep betrayal and hurt. When Christians affirm the claims of the transitioning person by using their assumed pronouns, etc., those family members who have to live every day with a hurt caused by a lie feel that Christians, who should know better, have really let them down.
So for me personally, I haven't actually been asked by anyone to refer to them as in a different way yet. But I imagine there will be people listening who are facing that, the workplace or schools. Those are two very kind of practical areas that some people might actually have to face this. How do you respond then specifically to kind of the schools and the workplace issue?
Well, schools first. Remember that when puberty is allowed to take its natural course, most cases of gender confusion are resolved. But sometimes, sadly, schools do wrongly rush to affirm children who claim to be transgender. And of course, little children in that class are expected to obey what their teachers tell them to do and to say. But I would say that if you have questions about schools, the Christian Institute does have an education officer who may be able to assist. And it is often the case that those with conscientious issues are able to reach some sort of accommodation with the school. And as you say, this impacts workplaces. So if you have questions about where you stand legally on this, for example, in your workplace, we have a legal defence department at the Christian Institute which may be able to provide assistance.
No, that's really useful to know, actually. And obviously this is an ongoing issue. We've talked about how this is just going to continue on. I don't see this going anywhere anytime soon. So have you any kind of final thoughts, particularly on this, which seems like such a practical issue facing people today? Yes.
I do find it alarming that there are non-Christians who are seeing this much more clearly than many Christians, that we lose something of our own integrity when we're forced to tell lies. And as Christians, surely we're to fear and obey God rather than to fear what other people think and fall in line with their demands to deny truth. And if at any point you believe you're being forced to say something that goes against your conscience, particularly if it contradicts your religious convictions, I'd simply say that this becomes an issue of compelled speech. And a landmark Supreme Court decision in 2018 ruled in favour of Asher's Baking Company in Northern Ireland, ruling that they had the right to decline an order to decorate a cake with a pro-gay marriage slogan. And what those judges were saying was that people should not be forced to affirm things they don't believe. Compelled speech contradicts all the principles of freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, and freedom of religion.
This book, I've read it. It's not a large book. It comes with some really good recommendations from some people I'm sure our listeners would kind of recognise. It just seems like a really good place to start. Is there anywhere else that you would encourage people? Because it seems that you're just saying Christians need to be in the know and they need to be willing to speak out. What else would you say? What are some other good resources?
Well, basically, my book is only a starter kit. As you say, it's only about 120 pages for those people who don't have time to read some of the really terrific resources available that are more like 300 pages. But there are good, longer resources, and I list those in the book. I think for your readers, one of the most compelling ways into this whole issue is by a story. And one of the people who endorsed my book is somebody called Walt Heyer, who himself transitioned to live as a woman with full reassignment surgery, etc. He lived as a woman for 10 years or so, but then realised that actually he had to be faithful to the biological sex he'd been created in. And he runs an organisation called Sex Change Regret, something like that. And I've listed most of his resources in my book. But if readers want to pick up his story, he's written a biography, an autobiography called Kid Dakota and the Secret at Grandma's House, and I give details of that. But it's a very compelling way into the tragedy represented by this whole issue, but the need to stand up against it.
Well, Sharon James, thank you so much for that, and thanks for taking the time to join us on Too Hot for Radio.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on, Tom.
Well, we have come to the end of another programme. I can very highly recommend that book by Sharon called Gender Ideology. It's released by Christian Focus. And definitely well worth a read. Thanks so much for listening today. Do check out our website, gnba.net, for more programmes that Good News Broadcasting produces. A weekday 10-minute programme, which Stuart does, and a half-an-hour weekly programme that I do. Both can be found on our website. If you've been missing Stuart, don't worry, he will be back with me next time for our Christmas special. Make sure you have a look out for that. It should be up within the next week. Thanks again, and we'll be back soon.